The desert heat outside Caesar's Palace hit like a furnace in August 1977, but inside the casino's private VIP lounge, the temperature was rising for an entirely different reason. Jimmy Page, the guitar god of Led Zeppelin, sat at a blackjack table with a scotch in one hand and his legendary reputation in the other. He was between shows on Zeppelin's North American tour, and Vegas was supposed to be his playground. He'd spent the afternoon winning thousands at the tables, surrounded by admirers who treated him like royalty. Then word came that Ace Frehley from Kiss was in the building, and Jimmy made a joke that would haunt him for decades. What happened in the next 2 hours would shatter Jimmy Page's assumptions about theatrical rock music, force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about guitar artistry, and prove that the man behind the Silver Space Ace makeup possessed a musical depth that the entire rock establishment had completely underestimated. Because Jimmy Page walked into that situation thinking it would be amusing to challenge the guy from the makeup band to a friendly guitar duel. He walked out knowing that Ace Frehley had been hiding his true abilities behind pyrotechnics and cartoon imagery, and that this underestimation was exactly what made the Space Ace so dangerous. If you enjoy deep dives into untold rock history, please subscribe to never miss these stories. The mid-70s created a peculiar hierarchy in rock music. At the top sat bands like Led Zeppelin, considered serious musicians, artists whose albums critics analyzed like literary texts. Their concerts were events where audiences came to worship at the altar of blues-based hard rock played by virtuosos who'd studied their craft in smoky London clubs. Jimmy Page was the high priest of this movement, his double-neck Gibson a symbol of musical sophistication, his solos lengthy explorations of Eastern scales and blues progressions that could stretch 20 minutes without losing the audience. Then there was Kiss. Everything the rock establishment dismissed as commercial garbage. The makeup, the costumes, the blood-spitting and fire-breathing and platform boots that made the band members look like characters from a comic book, rather than serious musicians. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley ran Kiss like a corporation, merchandising everything from lunchboxes to pinball machines, turning rock and roll into a brand rather than an art form. And Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, seemed like the ultimate example of style over substance. He wore silver space makeup, shot rockets from his guitar, and played the role of a mysterious alien visitor. Critics wrote him off as a theatrical prop, a guy who looked cool in the costume but couldn't possibly compete with real guitarists. Jimmy Page had bought into this narrative completely. He'd told journalists that Kiss represented everything wrong with modern rock, that they were clowns playing dress-up while real musicians like Zeppelin were creating timeless art. He'd never actually listened to Kiss albums closely, never analyzed what Ace was doing beneath the explosions and smoke effects. Why would he? You didn't need to taste fast food to know it wasn't haute cuisine. So when his tour manager mentioned that Ace Frehley had come to Caesars to see Robert Plant perform and wanted to pay respects to Page, Jimmy's first instinct was amusement tinged with condescension. He told the people around his table that maybe he'd challenge the space guy to a guitar contest, show him what real playing looked like. Everyone laughed. It would be like Picasso challenging someone who painted carnival posters. The outcome was predetermined, but Jimmy Page's manager, Peter Grant, had been around the music business long enough to recognize danger when he saw it. He'd watched Kiss sell out Madison Square Garden 4 nights in a row. He'd seen their album sales figures, knew they were moving units that made even Zeppelin's impressive numbers look modest. And Peter understood something that Jimmy didn't. You don't become that successful by accident, even with makeup and marketing. There had to be something real underneath. Peter pulled Jimmy aside. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Gene Simmons didn't pick that guitarist randomly. There's a reason Ace writes most of their hit riffs." Jimmy waved him off. "It's just for fun, Peter. The guy plays three-chord rock with explosions. I'll be gentle." 20 minutes later, Ace Frehley walked into the VIP lounge. He wasn't wearing makeup, wasn't in costume, just Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, 30 years old, looking tired from the road, but carrying his signature Gibson Les Paul in a battered case covered with flight stickers. He'd heard through the grapevine what Jimmy Page had said about challenging him, and instead of being offended, he'd accepted immediately. That should have been Jimmy's first warning. The casino's entertainment director, seeing an opportunity for something special, quickly arranged to move them to the venue's private rehearsal stage, a soundproofed room where headliners could work out arrangements before shows. Word spread through the casino like electricity. Within 15 minutes, the small room had filled with musicians, producers, casino performers, and industry people who happened to be in Vegas. Everyone wanted to see Led Zeppelin's guitar. God put the Kiss clown in his place. Jimmy set up first, plugging his famous Les Paul into a vintage Marshall stack that the casino kept for visiting performers. He felt good, confident, maybe a little drunk, but not enough to affect his playing. He'd done stadium shows completely wasted and still delivered performances that became bootleg legends. This would be easy. "What do you want to play?" Jimmy asked, assuming they'd trade solos on some blues standard, maybe a Robert Johnson song or something from the Yardbirds catalog. Ace looked at him with those dark Bronx eyes that had seen a lot more of rock's underbelly than people realized. "You choose," he said simply. "Make it something you're really good at. I want to see what real playing looks like." The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable. Jimmy felt a flash of annoyance. He decided to play "Since I've Been Loving You," the epic blues track from Led Zeppelin III, a song that showcased everything he did well: emotional bending, complex phrasing, dynamics that built from whisper to scream. It was a song that other guitarists feared to attempt because Jimmy's recorded version was so definitive. He launched into it, and for the first few minutes, everything went exactly as expected. His fingers found their familiar paths across the fretboard, executing the precise bends and vibratos that made his playing recognizable to millions of fans. The room watched respectfully. This was, after all, one of rock's certified masters demonstrating his craft. But something felt off. Maybe it was the intimate setting after months of playing stadiums. Maybe it was the scotch. Or maybe it was the way Ace Frehley stood against the back wall, arms crossed, face completely expressionless, watching like a poker player who already knew he was holding better cards. Jimmy found himself playing harder, faster, adding flourishes that weren't in the original, trying to prove something. By the time he finished, his solo had become a demonstration of technique rather than music, a resume recitation instead of a song. The room applauded, but it was polite applause, professional courtesy. Jimmy unplugged, suddenly feeling less confident than when he'd started. Ace walked to the amp without saying anything. He plugged in his Les Paul, and Jimmy noticed for the first time that Ace's guitar looked like it had been through a war. The finish was worn down to bare wood in places. The chrome hardware was tarnished. This wasn't a collector's piece or a pristine instrument meant for display. This was a working tool that had seen thousands of hours of stage time. "I'm going to play something I wrote," Ace said quietly. "It's called Fractured Mirror. It's not on any Kiss album yet. Just an instrumental I've been working on." Then Ace Frehley started to play, and the temperature in the room changed. What came out of that amplifier wasn't what anyone expected. No pyrotechnics, no stage tricks, no cartoon rock. Instead, Ace played a delicate, intricate acoustic-style piece on his electric guitar, using his fingers instead of a pick, creating layers of melody and harmony that seemed impossible from a single instrument. The song had a classical structure, movements that shifted from contemplative to passionate, techniques that borrowed from flamenco and jazz and blues, but synthesized them into something entirely original. Jimmy Page, who'd spent years studying obscure folk tunings and Arabic scales, recognized immediately that he was hearing something sophisticated. The note choices were unconventional, the time, signatures shifted subtly, and the emotional content was raw and genuine. This wasn't someone playing fast to impress people. This was a composer working out complex musical ideas through his instrument. But what shocked Jimmy most was the touch. Every note Ace played had weight and intention. His vibrato was perfect, not too fast or too slow, giving each sustained note a voice. The dynamics ranged from barely audible whispers to powerful crescendos, and Ace controlled it all with subtle variations in his picking attack and fretting pressure. This was the kind of control that took decades to develop, the kind of mastery that couldn't be faked. The piece lasted about 7 minutes, and when Ace finished, the room stayed silent. Not awkward silence, but the kind of quiet that falls when people have just witnessed something unexpectedly profound and need a moment to process what they've experienced. Jimmy Page stood there holding his guitar, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. He'd been completely wrong. Not just a little wrong, but fundamentally wrong about who Ace Frehley was as a musician. Ace unplugged and walked over to Jimmy. "You wanted to see real playing," he said, not unkindly. "That's what I do when nobody's watching. The space makeup, the smoking guitar, the rockets. That's my job in Kiss. That's what Gene and Paul need me to do for the show. But this," he gestured at his guitar, "this is who I actually am." Jimmy found his voice. "I didn't know you could play like that." "Nobody does," Ace said, "and that's exactly how I want it. You know why?" Jimmy shook his head. "Because the second rock critics and guitar magazines start taking me seriously, start analyzing my playing and comparing me to Clapton or Beck or you, that's when I lose my freedom. Right now, everyone thinks I'm just the space guy who can play some decent riffs. That means I can do whatever I want musically, and nobody questions it. I'm not trying to be the greatest guitarist in the world. I'm trying to write good songs and put on shows that make people happy. And sometimes, late at night in hotel rooms, I play things like what I just played, just for me." The conversation that followed was nothing like what Jimmy Page expected when he'd made his casual challenge earlier that evening. Ace talked about growing up in the Bronx, learning guitar by listening to records and trying to figure out what the players were doing without any formal instruction. He talked about his early influences, the jazz players his older brothers listened to, the flamenco music he'd heard in Spanish Harlem, the way he'd absorbed all these different styles and let them filter through his own instincts, rather than trying to copy them note for note. He talked about joining Kiss in 1973, about how Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had given him the Space Ace character and told him to make it his own. At first, he'd resented the makeup and costume, felt like it was hiding his real musicianship. But over time, he'd realized that the character gave him protection. Critics who dismissed the makeup never listened closely enough to hear what he was actually playing. Other guitarists who thought Kiss was simple never studied his arrangements. The Space Ace disguise let him hide his true abilities in plain sight. "You know what the best part is?" Ace said. a slight smile crossing his face. I can walk down the street in New York without makeup and nobody recognizes me. I can go to guitar shops, talk to other players, learn from them, and they have no idea they're talking to the guy from Kiss. I get to stay connected to real music, real musicians, without all the fame bullshit getting in the way. Jimmy asked about Ace's writing process, and what he learned surprised him further. Many of Kiss's biggest riffs, the hooks that had sold millions of albums, came from Ace's sessions alone in his apartment, experimenting with chord progressions and melodic ideas. Cold Gin, Shock Me, Rocket Ride, all these were Ace compositions that captured something beyond simple hard rock. They had melodic sophistication hidden under the heavy production and pyrotechnic presentation. Gene and Paul are business geniuses, Ace explained. They understand marketing and merchandising and how to turn a band into a brand. Peter Criss is an incredible drummer with perfect time. But when it comes to actual musical composition, to creating guitar parts that are memorable and emotionally resonant, that's mostly me. I just don't advertise it because it doesn't fit the Space Ace image. Then Ace said something that would stick with Jimmy Page for the rest of his career. You play for other musicians. I can hear it in your solos. You're always trying to prove something. Show that you know your scales and modes. Demonstrate your technique. That's not a criticism, man. You're incredible. But I learned a long time ago that the audience doesn't care about technique. They care about feeling something. So I write riffs that lodge in people's brains, that make them want to move, that connect emotionally. And I hide all my fancy playing inside those simple structures where nobody notices it. He picked up his Les Paul again. Watch this. I'll play the same melody 2 ways. He played a simple, beautiful melody, just a few notes. Then he played it again, but this time he added subtle ornamentations, tiny hammer-ons and pull-offs, slight variations in timing that made the melody more complex without changing its essential character. Hear the difference? Ace asked. The second version has all kinds of technical stuff happening, but it's buried in the melody. Casual listeners just hear a catchy tune. Musicians who pay attention hear all the detail work. That's how I approach everything in Kiss. Simple on the surface, sophisticated underneath, for anyone who cares to look. Jimmy Page felt his entire perspective shifting. He'd spent years in Led Zeppelin creating music that was obviously complex, wearing his influences and abilities on his sleeve. Kashmir announced its ambition in every arrangement. Stairway to Heaven built from acoustic intimacy to electric grandeur in a way that demanded to be taken seriously. He'd been fighting for respect from critics and peers, insisting that hard rock could be art. But Ace had achieved something different. He'd found freedom in being underestimated. While everyone dismissed Kiss as cartoon characters, Ace was writing sophisticated music and playing it to bigger audiences than almost anyone in rock. He wasn't fighting for critical respect because he didn't need it. The music was the reward, not the recognition. Can you show me some of what you're doing technically? Jimmy asked, his competitive instinct replaced by genuine curiosity. For the next hour, in front of an audience that had come expecting a contest but was now witnessing a masterclass, Ace Frehley showed Jimmy Page techniques he'd developed over years of experimentation. The way he used hybrid picking, combining pick and fingers, to create textures that sounded like multiple guitars. His approach to string bending, pushing notes sharp, and then releasing them slowly to create vocal-like qualities. How he voiced chords in unconventional ways that created maximum harmonic impact with minimum notes. He demonstrated his philosophy of tone, explaining that he wanted his guitar to sound warm and full in the mix. sitting perfectly between bass and drums without fighting with the vocals. This was why his solos in Kiss songs were often shorter and more melodic than the extended jams that other rock guitarists favored. He was serving the song, not using it as a vehicle for self-expression. "Listen," Ace said, "I could play 10-minute solos like you do. I could show off all the jazz and classical stuff I've absorbed. But that's not what people come to a Kiss show for. They want spectacle and energy and songs they can sing along to. So I give them that. And late at night, in hotel rooms, I play the other stuff. Best of both worlds." Someone in the audience, a session musician who'd played with both Zeppelin and Kiss at various points, spoke up. "Ace, why don't you do a solo album? Show people what you can really do?" Ace looked thoughtful. "Maybe someday. Right now, Kiss is where I need to be. Gene and Paul have created this incredible platform. We're reaching audiences that most bands can only dream about. And yeah, I have to wear the makeup and shoot the rockets, but I also get to play my songs to hundreds of thousands of people. That's not a bad trade-off." As the evening wound down and people started drifting away, Jimmy Page and Ace Frehley sat in the empty rehearsal space. Two guitarists from very different worlds, finding common ground in their shared obsession with the instrument. "I owe you an apology," Jimmy said. "I completely misjudged you." Ace shrugged. "Most people do. It's okay. Better to be underestimated than overhyped. Less pressure that way." "But don't you want recognition for what you can actually do?" "From who?" Ace asked. "Critics who've never sold out an arena? Other guitarists who spend more time talking about playing than actually playing? I get recognition from the people who matter, the audiences who come to our shows and connect with the music. That's enough for me." Jimmy thought about his own relationship with fame and recognition. The constant pressure to top himself, to prove that Led Zeppelin wasn't just a heavy version of the blues, to fight against critics who dismissed them as derivative or bombastic. The weight of being considered one of rock's greatest guitarists. The expectation that every solo should be legendary, every album a masterpiece. Ace seemed free from all that. He'd found a way to have a massively successful career while maintaining artistic integrity, to play for enormous audiences while keeping his deepest musical self private and protected. It was a different kind of wisdom than Jimmy possessed, perhaps even more valuable. "You know what's funny?" Ace said as they packed up their guitars. "In 10 years, people will probably still argue about who's better, you or me. And they'll never understand that we're not even playing the same game. You're trying to create art that lasts forever. I'm trying to give people the best 2 hours of their week. Both things are valid." They exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch, knowing they probably wouldn't, but meaning it sincerely in the moment. As Ace headed back to his hotel and Jimmy returned to the casino floor, both men carried something new from the encounter. What happened after that night rippled through rock music in ways that weren't always obvious, but were significant nonetheless. Jimmy Page, in interviews over the following years, would occasionally mention the importance of not dismissing musicians based on their image, of recognizing that showmanship and musicianship weren't mutually exclusive. Led Zeppelin's final albums, particularly In Through the Outdoor, showed a willingness to incorporate more direct melodic guitar work alongside the elaborate solos Jimmy was known for. Ace Frehley did eventually release a solo album in 1978, and it became the biggest selling of all 4 Kiss solo albums released that year. New York Groove became a top 20 hit, proving that Ace had commercial instincts beyond the Kiss formula. But more importantly, the album showcased his songwriting and guitar work without the pyrotechnics, revealing to anyone who listened carefully that the Space Ace had been hiding sophisticated musicianship all along. The story of the Las Vegas encounter spread through rock circles, though details varied depending on who told it. Some versions claimed Jimmy and Ace had jammed for hours, creating spontaneous compositions that were recorded but never released. Others said the confrontation had been hostile, with egos clashing before mutual respect emerged. The truth, as usual, was more nuanced and more interesting than the legends. Two musicians from different approaches to rock and roll had met, challenged each other's assumptions, and both came away changed. Jimmy learned that success in rock wasn't just about critical respect or technical mastery, that there were different ways to connect with audiences and different definitions of artistic integrity. Ace confirmed what he already knew, that his approach of hiding sophistication within apparent simplicity was not just valid, but potentially more sustainable than constantly trying to prove his worth to skeptics. The guitar has 6 strings, and both Jimmy Page and Ace Frehley found ways to make those 6 strings communicate their unique visions of what rock music could be. One did it through obvious ambition and undeniable virtuosity. The other through deceptive simplicity and strategic understatement. And on one August night in Las Vegas, these two approaches met, recognized each other, and created a moment that challenged rock music's hierarchies and assumptions. Because in the end, great guitarists aren't defined by how they're perceived by critics or peers. They're defined by their ability to connect with audiences, to create music that moves people, to make those 6 strings say something true. Jimmy Page did this through epic compositions and virtuosic solos that demanded to be taken seriously. Ace Frehley did it through memorable riffs and strategic showmanship that let his real abilities hide in plain sight. The Las Vegas Showdown wasn't about who was better. It was about understanding that rock music was big enough for multiple approaches, that theatrical presentation and serious musicianship weren't opposites, and that sometimes the most dangerous guitarist in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Ace Frehley walked away from that night still wearing his Space Ace identity, still shooting rockets from his guitar, still playing the role that Kiss needed him to play. But anyone who was there, anyone who heard him play Fractured Mirror in that intimate setting, knew the truth. Behind the silver makeup and the cartoon imagery was a guitarist of genuine depth and sophistication, a musician who'd simply chosen a different path to success than the one rock's establishment prescribed. And Jimmy Page, who'd thought he was doing the guy from the makeup band a favor by challenging him, learned that assumptions about who's serious and who's not, who's a real musician and who's just a showman, were far more complicated than he'd imagined. The Space Ace had taught Led Zeppelin's guitar god a lesson in humility, artistry, and the multiple ways that greatness can manifest in rock and roll. Years later, after both men had lived through the ups and downs of rock careers, the triumphs and struggles, the acclaim and criticism, those who were close to them would occasionally hear them reference that night in Vegas. Not as a competition with a winner and loser, but as a moment of genuine connection between two artists who, beneath their very different images, shared the same obsessive love for the guitar and the same drive to make those 6 strings say something meaningful. The bet wasn't about pride. The lesson wasn't about superiority. It was about recognizing that rock music's greatest strength has always been its diversity, its ability to contain multitudes, to let a blues purist and a space-themed showman both find ways to move audiences and create lasting music. Ace Frehley and Jimmy Page represented different aspects of rock's infinite possibilities, and in that desert casino for a few hours, those possibilities met and acknowledged each other with the respect that true artistry demands.